Hello, everybody. Hello, and thank you for everyone for joining us for the 11th Canada-EU Business Lecture organized by the Center for European Study together with the Sprott School of Business. My name is Crina Viju, and I'm the academic coordinator of the Center for European Studies. And before I introduce the speaker, I would like to say a few words about the Center and the long-standing partnership between the Center and the Sprott School of Business. As you probably most of you know, the Center was established in 2000 and 2006 was designated as a Carleton University Research Center. In the same year, the European Commission designated the Center as an EU Center of Excellence and also was selected to serve as network coordinator for Canadian Network of EU Centers of Excellence. The mandate of the Center is to further research, teaching, and public outreach activities in the area of European studies at Carleton University and in Ottawa area. And this annual lecture represents a great example of our public outreach. I would like to acknowledge the support received from the European Commission to organize the event, which represents part of our effort to reach the business students and the business community. And also, I would like to acknowledge the long-standing partnership between Sprott School of Business and the Center for European Studies on this lecture and other issues, such as organizing the briefing sessions for the business students going on exchange to Europe. And now, of course, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michel Mastroeni. Dr. Mastroeni is currently an Inogen Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Prior to working at the University of Edinburgh, he was an ESRC Research Fellow at Kingston Business School, investigating skill and research policy in the UK and Ireland, and the management of knowledge workers in the pharmaceutical and IT sectors. Before moving to the UK, Dr. Mastroeni was a senior policy advisor for the Ministry of Research and Innovation in Ontario, Canada, where he managed research funding programs targeting local universities and research institutes, as well as provided policy advice on various issues. Dr. Mastroeni has a PhD in political science from University of Toronto. Among other projects that he is currently involved in, he is working on an EU-funded project to improve policymakers' ability to assess their country region's capacities in a high-tech sector and develop policy processes suitable to their specific context. While the project has focused on the biotechnology sector, the approach has been designed to address a variety of knowledge-intensive sectors. And thus, today's lecture examines risk perception and risk management in European treatment of genetically modified products, while addressing a comparison with the Canadian and US systems and their respective agriculture biotechnology development. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mastroeni.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. So as Crina mentioned, my name is Michele Mastroeni, or Mike if you prefer, currently at the University of Edinburgh, but it's nice to be back in Canada. I always try to take advantage of the visits whenever I can. And today I'm going to be talking about the regulation of genetically modified crops in Europe. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about where I'm from in terms of the Inogen Institute, just to get a perspective of the just for you to get a perspective of our perspective of how we approached this issue. So Inogen was originally an ESRC, that's the equivalent of SSHRC in the UK, research center, established about 10 years ago to look at innovation aspects and innovation issues regarding the life sciences, all from a social science perspective. Okay, so it's a multidisciplinary institute. So people such as myself, political scientists, we work with economists, business scholars, sociologists, etc., looking at the interplay of different elements within an innovation system, the socio-political, economic, and technical aspects of innovation systems, in order to determine how best to deliver technologies from the bench side to the bedside, or to the field, or to the market, depending on the technology that you're looking at. So I myself, my focus is mostly around systems of innovation, whether national or regional or sectoral, and that's the perspective I bring to the table. And at the Inogen Institute, what we do is we take a perspective where we see innovation as being the interplay between three different communities and sets of stakeholders, where you have the policymakers and government stakeholders interacting with members of the public and stakeholder groups, civil society groups, and so on, clientele groups, patient groups, whatever the technology you're dealing with is, and the innovation community, so the entrepreneurs or the R&D scientists or the firms that are being innovative. And it's this interplay that we think is quite important. And a lot of the work that we've done has been in the life sciences, as I mentioned, because of the mandate, but a lot of the techniques and models that we use are quite technology agnostic, so it doesn't really matter. You can apply them to most any sectors. So we've worked in everything from GM crops, industrial biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, stem cell therapies, etc. And as we're a multidisciplinary institute, we of course draw upon all of your standard social science methodologies that are available to you, but we've also been working on quite a few methodologies that and frameworks of approaching problems that are our own. So, for example, ALSIS is a method of looking at business models or trying to determine business models for emerging technologies and innovations and connecting them to value systems and how they also interact with the broader socio-political system. Looking at adaptive governance, so how methods and frameworks of looking at regulatory aspects and how they can change or adapt depending on evidence-based decisions. And critical stakeholder engagement, so different techniques and approaches to engaging stakeholders, NGOs, industry, policy all together in a kind of through workshops or sandbox workshops in that sense. Okay. So today, though, I'm going to talk about an ongoing project, and it is still ongoing, that at Inogen we've been working on that arose through discussions with Syngenta, which is an ag biotech company, and funded by the ESRC as well. Now, this was not this project is regarding the current regulatory system as applied to GM crops, and potentially influencing the future development of future technologies, for example, such as synthetic biology. It's not exactly a research project, so I want to be upfront about it. Though it has involved some research, mostly because we found a lot of these things so fascinating. It's been a bit of a rabbit hole where the more you start exploring issues, the deeper you get into it. And in fact, we've been working on this project much longer than we were mandated to, precisely because of its interest and because we want to try to make this more of a springboard for deeper research later on. But rather, this was a knowledge exchange project where we would be working with Syngenta to get access to the dossiers, the regulatory dossiers that they submitted with two particular GM crops, analyze the gray literature, and then approach and analyze the regulatory system itself outside of the Syngenta involvement to see how things are. So, in terms of some background, Syngenta is one of the world's leading plant science-based companies with ongoing research and development in both crop protection, chemicals, and biotech. Staff at Inogen, so my senior colleagues, have been involved in various projects looking at ag biotech development for quite a number of years, for a few decades actually. And so the background that they've brought to the table is the perception that since the 1990s, there's quite a large degree of uncertainty surrounding the development of GM crops, and that uncertainty was much greater than it is today. But the expectation at the time was that as further evidence of the impacts of GM crops and so on would evolve, then the regulatory system would evolve with it, and the precautionary approach would be modified. So the precautionary approach is what the European Commission has taken to be the basis for the regulatory system, where if there is a question, if there's a remaining question of or a remaining doubt as to the safety, they would err on the side of caution rather than assume no harm, much like the American system does. However, in the European Union, there's now considerable agreement that despite the evidence of the safety of GM crops that has been coming up through many different studies, both to the environment and to the people, the precautionary principle based approach to GM regulation has not been modified. In fact, it's ossified and it's become more difficult. And part of the perceived challenge, as initially put forward by Syngenta, according to them, was that there exists a risk assessment policy gap based on very normative and imprecise policy language, but also in terms of uncertainty or not clearly defined societal expectations for the environment. So without these clear policy objectives, any additional scientific studies simply provide a larger collection of data from which proponents and opponents of particular decisions can justify their political views. And so in addition, when you have multiple stakeholder groups, as you have in the case of GM crops, with very strong normative positions, you're now in a position where it's very difficult to get clear policy objectives once the debate's already started rolling and once we're at this condition where we are, for example, with GM crops. So the objectives that we had for this project were very much to explore the nature and origins of this risk assessment gap, develop 2 case studies of GM crops so one was for herbicide-tolerant maize, GA21, and BT maize, so in order to understand what's going on through that process. To then think about how this risk assessment gap might be minimized. And then once we complete the project, to engage with industry, policymakers and stakeholder groups, NGOs, civil society groups and so on, to discuss our findings. And I mean, the importance of the issue is that it could potentially affect the possibility of obtaining food security as the GM crop debate becomes stronger and the regulatory system becomes it remains stalled. It could affect. It brings up questions of food security as well as the fuel and energy debate, the food-fuel balance in terms of feedstocks from crops, and it also begins rising issues of market opportunities and economic competition that might be lost for Europe, particularly research and development in companies and agricultural productivity. And the future technologies, such as synthetic biology, might be stalled if the same regulatory structures apply to them. And the European regulatory system for GM crops is widely regarded as a failure of evidence-based risk governance. It's one of the most onerous regulatory systems in existence for a commercially traded product, despite lack of evidence of health or environment-related risks in terms of the scientific evidence that comes out, peer-reviewed evidence, and so on. So the existing cost to the EU of the regulatory system for GM crops in terms of food and feed and opportunities and jobs lost and different companies' disadvantages is likely to be multiplied if this regulatory approach is extended down the line. So as it stands, the regulatory system for GM crops we can say finishes rather than begins with a political decision at the European Council of Ministers and at the European Commission. The process begins with a company submitted an application through a national competent authority. So for example, Syngenta might submit a dossier to the UK competent authority who then submits it to the European Food and Safety Authority. And who then, once the European Food Safety Authority has the dossier, they are supposed to deliver their opinion within 6 months, once they've confirmed the completeness of the application. Member states are requested to give their opinion within the first 3 months of this submission, and it should be kept in mind, however, that the clock stops whenever member states, filtering their questions through EFSA or EFSA itself, request further information. EFSA will also assign an environmental risk assessment to a member state and request that it be submitted within 4 months of receiving the application. And again, this particular authority can also stop the clock by asking questions through EFSA to then to Syngenta. Once this is done, EFSA then provides its opinion and passes it onward to the European Commission, who issues a draft of the decision. The decision draft is then passed to the Standing Committee, where they're supposed to have a vote. Depending on the results of this vote, it will then be passed on to the Council of Ministers and to the European Commission. The kinds of votes that we're talking about, you can either have a qualified majority, which has only ever happened once, or a non-qualified majority, or disagreement. Most of the times we have a non-qualified majority based on in terms of, if you look at some of the past records, which I'll show. You have a non-qualified majority in terms of safety assessments. And what a qualified majority is a 232 out of 321 voters, or 62% of the represented population. If a qualified majority is not reached, then within 90 days a second vote has to be held. And if a second vote does not result in a qualified majority, then the European Commission has the authority to pass to allow that crop to then be used. However, up to this date, the European Commission has not used this authority. A lot of the perception that we've received from people that we've interviewed and discussed with is that the European Commission is actually quite hesitant to do that because they fear the political fallout of not having a qualified majority. This is in contrast to the process in Canada and the US, which are product rather than process-oriented. So in the EU, it's a process-oriented regulatory system where anything that is genetically modified in the laboratory, so through transgenetics, automatically has to go through this system. Whereas in Canada, it's product-based. So anything that is simply a new event, it can be genetically modified, but through crossbreeding or through laboratory involvements and so on, and it results in a novel plant trait, then that's what's being modified. So it's not so much the process that they worry about in Canada and also the US, but rather the end product in itself, whereas in the EU, it's the process itself, not so much the end product. And of course, the EU, or not of course, but the Canada and the US systems do not assume the potential of harm. They assume no harm unless proven otherwise, whereas in Europe it's a precautionary approach where the onus of proof of safety is upon the person making the application or the group making the application. Now, of course, there are criticisms and possible conflicts of interest within the Canadian and US system in the sense that a lot of the regulatory agencies also have branches that fund agricultural research, and of course the agricultural research being funded, if it's approved to the regulatory agency, they can then license it and make money off it. So there is a conflict of interest to a certain extent there. But having said that, the process begins with the policy decisions and ends with the scientific and technical decisions, whereas in Europe, it's the opposite. Okay? So the European Food and Safety Authority does the technical scientific assessments, and then the final decisions at the European Committee and the Standing Committee and so on are political mostly. Okay? So for our project, we've been given access to the documents, as I mentioned, for the 2 GM crops to use as case studies so that we could trace the process through that regulatory process, through the regulatory system. And the 2 crops that we have are BT11, which is a GM insect-resistant maize, that also contains a gene that provides tolerance to the herbicide glufosinate. If at some point you can't hear me because the microphones are funny, just let me know, okay? And then GA21, which is a GM maize that is tolerant to the herbicide glyphosate. Now, in all of the dossiers that are submitted by Syngenta, by anybody going through the regulatory process, and what we saw in the dossiers there, you have various components. So there's a comparison to the non-GM counterpart or the non-GM crop. So if we're talking about GM maize, then you look at non-modified corn crops. You look at the reproduction differences, you look at the survivability within the wild, so outside of a cultivated environment. You look at whether or not there would be any gene transfer between other crops, but also other plants and other organisms within the environment. Impacts on human health, toxicity, and a battery of tests on human health. The environmental effects, the effects on biodiversity, the effects on non-target organisms. So if it's meant to be an herbicide, is it going to impact earthworms and different aspects like that? And these are mostly based on, so the way Syngenta approaches the dossier is they have different tiers, and their preferred method is to submit third-party studies in the dossier first, and then if further studies are required or requested from EFSA, then they would have to go out and do those further studies and then submit them later. And of course, not all the information will be on hand from third-party studies, so they'll have to probably do some of their own field studies and work regardless, but that's the ideal in that sense. So the BT11, I'm just going to walk through the case progressions for each one, and just to give you a sense of what's been going on. So BT11 was an early filing in 1998, and it was actually filed before the European Food and Safety Authority was established. So this was filed before this setup was in existence. Okay. Anyway, but in 1998, it was filed with the French authorities, who conducted a first assessment. In 2001, the EU set up the current regulatory system, creating EFSA, and laid out new principles of risk assessment. Syngenta then updated its files in order to address these new principles. In 2003, the French competent authority stated that no scientific evidence of risk of BT11 was shown, and In 2004, EFSA assessed the dossier because member states were questioning the French authorities' assessment, and in 2005 agreed with the French authorities' assessment. In June 2006, the European Commission called on EFSA to address further outstanding complaints from member states. EFSA then published in 2006 its response, reiterating its position. The European Commission then came back and cited 11 studies, saying that the evidence was insufficient and that there's doubt on the safety of these kinds of this kind of product. And so there was a protest lodged by the European Federation of Biotechnology stating that they were using unscientific approaches to genetically modified crops. And in 2008, EFSA responded by once again stating that the evidence did not show risk of safety, having analyzed those studies themselves. In 2009, European Commission published the position that no evidence of BT11, of no evidence of adverse effects, and the Standing Committee voted with no qualified majority. As it stands, BT11 remains stalled from its first filing in 1998. There has been no second vote within that 90-day period of time that they've had. GA21's progress is slightly different, much more current. In 2008, EFSA received the Syngenta dossier through the UK competent authority, and this was after it had already been approved for import in terms of food and feed. This is a cultivation permit that they're asking for. So being able to cultivate it within the EU. So because this was filed within the current regulatory processes, EFSA endeavored to keep it to 6 months decision, with the 3-month period included for member state comments and the 4-month period of the environmental risk assessment by the Czech competent authority. So the clock started on October 2008 because that's when they assessed that the dossier was complete. EFSA then requested additional information and stopped the clock on the 3rd of February 2009 for 227 working days, stopped the clock again on January 12, 2010 for 202 working days, and a third time on the 26th of October for 286 working days in 2010. So that overall, the time delay or clock stop was 715 working days on top of the 6-month period that they were supposed to be looking at. So the clock was stopped 3 times while 4 sets of questions were submitted to Syngenta. They were the questions that were filtered through from the Czech Republic and its environmental risk assessment and from the member states during that 3-month period. And the questions that were filtered through by EFSA were mostly So the questions were mostly looking at aspects of monitoring, of the environmental monitoring of risk assessment, and they were also asking for further impact on the diversity. So it's kind of thing out. What's interesting to note is that a lot of the aspects that were happening with the Czech Republic, so the questions, the reasons why monitoring was requested by the Czech Republic Environmental Agency was that they were concerned about the biodiversity impact of the herbicide use that would supposedly go in conjunction with the GA21, as well as, so the aspects there were 2 problems with this point of the questions according to Syngenta. They answered the questions, but they thought the delay was unnecessary, or not unnecessary. The delay was a result because, first of all, there was no definition of biodiversity and the kind of positive biodiversity that people wanted to see, but also because oh, here we go. Okay. Let's see if we can do this. Right. But also because they were looking at and really focusing on the herbicide rather than the GM crop. So the problem with the regulatory system, so to us this might seem very logical, and I in fact think it's very logical, but in terms of the regulatory system, it actually divides the different dossiers between the crop itself and the herbicide use, and the data packages are not asked to be joint. So again, most of what the Czech Republic was focusing on was the herbicide itself, and had these things been made clear up front, then it might have helped some of the time delay on that aspect. So anyway, these issues were what spurred the request for further monitoring. I also think I found it fascinating that when we were looking at the various questions that were submitted during the 3-month period from member states, 84 questions were submitted. 10 were simply reference statements. Okay, and so I've actually looked at and analyzed all of these myself. So 10 were actually reference statements simply saying, you know, on this topic you should see study X or whatever. No statement of what you should do with study X or what that means and so on, but just simply see study X. 5 were simply negative statements. This member state does not like GM crops or something of that nature. 26 requested more data or clarification. Fairly neutrally framed, but simply asking for further information on top of what was in the dossier. And 43 actually questioned and challenged the rigor and the studies submitted by Syngenta, saying that they weren't sufficient, that they did not address the questions that they wanted to be addressed, and that just were not good enough. 36 of the 43 questions came from only 2 member states, Austria and Germany. What's also interesting is that Germany had 2 competent authorities making comments. The official competent authority, which I believe was the Food and Health Authority, and then the environmental authority that they have. What was interesting to me was that they would actually conflict with each other on different points, on at least 4 different points. Whereas the Food and Health competent authority stated that the evidence was sufficient and didn't show any risk, and they were satisfied with it, the environmental authority disagreed and wanted to see further evidence. And I don't know if there was any communication between them, but these are the questions that were documented by EFSA in its submission. So what you have to keep in mind is that EFSA has to address, not Syngenta, EFSA has to address each and every question and each and every statement in some way, shape, or form, stating whether it's relevant or not, agreeing or disagreeing with the statement based on scientific aspects, rigors, you know, the rigors of the study, whether the hypothesis is relevant, whether the question is relevant, and so on. And then the ones that it agrees with or it sees as that they can't answer, then they will pass on to Syngenta, which is when the clock stops and more requests of information is given. So Syngenta responded to all these questions, submitted them to EFSA, who then published their decision on December 26, 2011, and we're still waiting for a final decision on what happens there. So this table, I know you can't read the detail, but I just want to illustrate some of the points. This is a table produced by Europa Bio, which is the industry association for agricultural biotechnology in Europe. And this is a list of genetically modified crops currently in the regulatory system. The accumulated and undue delay, so this is on top of the 6-month or the official time period that's supposed to be there, is 51 years, all told, for these crops. Okay? For GA21, which is the second case study that I was talking about, okay, it was submitted in 2008, as I mentioned. The final decision was published on this date in 2011. From this date, it has now been 17 months, 18 days and counting, or at least from the point of this publication, when it was scheduled for the first vote, which was supposed to be 3 months after the publication of the decision. Then you have, where is it? BT11 here, which was the other case study we were talking about. Here it's filed in 1996. I had 1998, but anyway. So 1996, 2005, voted after 45 months and 6 days, the first time. Okay, no qualified majority. 51 months and 9 days after this first vote is what we're still waiting for. Okay, so this is the undue delay aspect that's on top of it. So, okay. So what do we see? We see that the regulatory, the information that's coming to us from, and the information that we have in terms of the official European documents, regulatory guidelines, and so on, is that the regulatory objectives are not clearly defined. So it's actually difficult to determine what data to provide within the package and how to package it. I mean, knowing what I would know now, my advice to Syngenta would be, everything in the kitchen sink. If it's a GM crop, also throw in everything that has to do with the herbicide that's related to it or other chemicals and so on. But this is not exactly clear, and so there's a lot of give and take in this sense. Even when the objectives seem to be defined, the parameters of what's acceptable evidence has not been defined and are constantly being moved. So a study which in 1 year might be deemed sufficient within a few months of having read that might be deemed insufficient because somebody has considered that there's a new kind of method come out and a new study that, shows a more fine-grained analysis and so on. So therefore, this is constantly being moved. So they haven't set these parameters. There's even less discussion of evidence. In fact, no discussion of evidence required for opposition. So member states and so on posing questions, challenging the rigor and so on, are not under any obligation to provide any kind of evidence as to, or don't have any parameters of evidence that they have to submit in order to question this. And then, of course, there's clear evidence of political factors impacting progress. We know about a lot of lobbying happening in terms of the civil society groups regarding anti-GM. There's a lot of cancellations of meetings before votes are supposed to happen and so on. So these are all questions that come up. So what's the potential impact here? The impact of all these delays is that the EU, this is according to Europa Bio, the EU is the biggest importer of agricultural commodities, and many of them are actually based on genetically modified crops, these imports. It's a net importer, and it's dependent on them. And not only that, in terms of the future, this is going to go crazy on me. If a product is approved for cultivation elsewhere, and it's not yet approved for EU and it's stalled, then it might very well be shipped to other markets and other opportunities and so on. So the EU is losing out from these potential products. And according to Europa Bio, this leaves EU farmers without the options of using these kinds of products. And what we see, they claim is that the food prices will continue to rise, EU farmers are less competitive, it increases EU import dependency, and creates legal and political uncertainty for companies. And this is actually one of the points that the companies, industrial stakeholders have said to us, is that they would be less bothered if the European Commission simply said, we will not allow GM crops within the border. That would actually be preferable to the ambiguous framework that they have right now, where they're allowing you to submit these crops and delaying them, installing them, and so on. But so it's almost like it's an unofficial anti-GM regulatory system, but so they're wasting their time and money and their investments in trying to get through the regulatory process. And in fact, companies such as BASF have already decided to leave the European market because they just don't want to deal with it. So of course, this means that large R&D capacities and high value added work is leaving Europe in these areas, which some people might say that's good, we don't want GM crops, but what about all the other technologies that they are working on that could be developed within European borders? So, and there are in fact similar normative and political objectives being raised about new emerging technologies such as synthetic biology. Potentially nipping these kinds of new technologies in the bud, because we don't know what something like synthetic biology could do. We don't know what its positive or negative impacts could be. And so what we see in this case, what's illustrated by these case studies that we've seen and we're starting to see with other emerging technologies, that GM crops in the 1990s and so on was a case where they wanted to bring stakeholder engagement in terms of the regulatory system upstream. So when the technology was fairly new and when they didn't quite have all the evidence, but they wanted to start bringing the engagement forward and saying, all right, well, what can we do to start to keep making things safe, and how do we want to see regulation? So this is where the precautionary principle was taken, and with the idea that as evidence was brought forward, it would be adjusted. So as the technology moved downstream, it would then be adjusted if no evidence of harm was shown over a period of time. But of course, you have the political conflict of various groups, anti-GM, pro-GM, and so on, where you have a turbulence in the system, and right now, as it stands, that turbulence is contributing to this kind of lack of development within the regulatory system, or lack of progress within the regulatory system. So part of the thinking that we have at Inogen in terms of how you can start addressing these aspects is that that we should be conscious that regulation can be modified in the light of changes in risk assessment and improved scientific understanding of the technology. It should also be a question of not simply addressing or thinking about the risks of the technology, but balancing these risks with the potential benefits. Okay? What if genetically modified crops can be harmful? What if? But what are the potential benefits that that crop could have, in the shorter to medium term and even the long term. Part of the problem is that, if to show no harm is to show a negative, and you can never actually have full proof of a negative. I mean, until you have proof of the harm somewhere. So to show that there is no harm is, you can never prove it indefinitely. So you can always push the precautionary principle further, further, and further. And this is one of the things. There's no set boundary as to how far they'll do that. And of course, we have to, we believe that we should balance the interests and values of all relevant stakeholders. Okay, so researchers, industry, policymakers, civil society groups, the farmers, and so on. And the conflict, for example, in the EU, we don't see, it's not a straightforward, in the UK, sorry, it's not a straightforward conflict. There are many farmers' unions who want to have access to these kinds of products and crops, but they're not allowed to, and so they are actually lobbying on the opposite side. So it's kind of one of these things. And we should be explicit about the political influences on policy decisions, just to have that clarity. In terms of the stakeholder engagement, we believe that we should be equally skeptical about the motivations of both. It's very easy, and I think there's reason for the skepticism to exist. But it's very easy to be skeptical about industry's motivations. Okay, particularly as we see in the general media and so on, that skepticism is very strong. But perhaps we could use with some injection of skepticism on the other side as well. Just to balance the table. And this also leads to the fact that we want to develop standards of engagement for the quality of evidence on which decisions are based. So evidence from both sides. We want to see that same rigor, that same kind of quality of evidence from both sides, or all sides, however many sides there may be. And we also have to, of course, remind ourselves that innovation is not simply the scientific technical process, but also involves regulatory processes as well, and that these will have an impact on innovation, on the development of innovation, or on the lack of development of innovation, and how R&D, entrepreneurial and innovative companies will perceive a particular market and area and so on. Once again, we consider the benefits of the technology and balance it with the costs and risks. No technology is going to be without costs, of course, or without risks, but it's a question of balancing those possible benefits as well. And of course, considering that we're all hopefully democratic around here, it would be nice to see that element of choice on all sides being maintained to a certain extent. So, I for one have no problems, with labeling genetically modified crops and so on. And Europe, in fact, does have a labeling requirement. So we get in that sense. So these are the different points that we've seen regarding the issue. These are kind of the initial positions that we're putting forward as having looked at this as a third party. And I think, to close, I'd like to, clearly state that my position here is, as a scholar of innovation and the overall impacts on the system, I wouldn't say I'm not pro-GM. I'm perhaps anti-GM in how some of the approach has been taken, but that's just in the sense of leveling the playing field of evidence and so on. So that's so I'll close there, and I'll thank you very much. So.